things first. Jenna Wolf, Nick Wright, Brandon Marshall, Kevin Wilds. We switched seats. I had to practice everybody's name. I did it, and it worked well. I am holding here 2 hours of a fantastic show. So we're not going to waste time. We are going to dive right in with last night's action. Game 5, Mavericks Clippers, and Paul George finally showed up, guys. After 4 inefficient games, he put up a very efficient 35 points to lead all scorers on very efficient 12 of 18 shooting. We'll hear what changed for Paul George in a second. But back to last night's game, Luka Doncic came back down to earth with a 22-8-4 line. That's not going to do it as the Clippers get the big win, retake momentum, and can now close out the series on Thursday night. So, Nick, I'll start with you. You think Paul George and Kawhi proved to you that they are title contenders after what became a very dominant win over the Dallas Mavericks last night?
Oh, when the Clippers play like this, they're not just title contenders. They're one of the 3 best teams in basketball. That's always been true. The problem for the Clippers is you have no idea on any given night if they're going to show up for the full 48 minutes. The first 16 minutes of this game looked almost identical to the first 16 minutes of Game 4. The Clippers had a 22-point lead at the 8-minute mark of the second quarter last night. They had a 21-point lead at the 8-minute mark of the second quarter of the previous game. The difference was they kept their foot on the gas in Game 5, unlike Game 4. They took advantage of their decided schematic advantages against the Mavs. The Mavs have 1 legitimate wing defender. The Clippers should have 2 legitimate wing stars. So if Paul George is clicking, all of a sudden, Michael Kidd-Gilchrist has to come on the court, and he is a really, really limited offensive player. All of a sudden, the Mavs are struggling to find the right matchups. Additionally, when Kristaps ain't playing, you can focus your entire defense on slowing down Luka Doncic, which is what they did last night. And so, last night's game didn't shock me. I said on the show yesterday and then doubled down on Twitter that I thought Clippers -8 was the play. You would expect the Clippers to come out and show you their full force in a Game 5 after what happened in Game 4. To me, the judgment game, Jenna, will be, do they do the same thing in Game 6? Or now, with a game to play with, do they let their foot off the gas again? A championship-level team would come out in Game 6 with a chance to end the series and do not 154 points, but do similar things in Game 6, what they did in Game 5. So, of course, they're more than a contender when they play like this. The question is, Jenna, how often are they going to give the requisite effort to play like this?
And then clearly the X factor, echoing what you said, is Paul George. And if he decides to show up, and if so, how much he's going to contribute. Finally broke out of that slump. 35 points on 67% shooting from Paul George last night. Brandon, you heard something from him after the game that really struck you. I want to ask you about it, but first take a listen to this.
You know, I underestimated mental health, honestly. I had anxiety. A little bit of depression, just being locked in here, and you know, I just wasn't there. I checked out, and it was, you know, games 2, 3, 4. I wasn't there. I felt like I wasn't there. But you know, shout out to the people that was in my corner, people that gave me the words.
Really refreshing sentiments and honesty. Yeah, from a professional player, you don't hear that much about what life is like off the court, because when we cover these games, we cover the action on the court and we think it stops there. But Brandon, what was your reaction to what Paul George had to say?
Powerful. I think a lot of us underestimate the impact on mental health and on mental fitness. I knew something was off Monday. You just don't hear those type of comments coming out of a press conference when a guy's talking about getting out of a slump. You don't see star players turning off mentions and comments on social media, because we know that the media is watching, and it'll be a tagline, it'll be a headline on all the talk shows. So you just don't see that. I think that this is a topic we gotta push back on the forefront of our country. It happens to all of us. There's 320 million Americans, and almost 100 personally deal with some type of mental health challenge. If it doesn't affect you, it affects a loved one. I think professional sports is one of the most volatile environments you can be in, because every day you walk in the locker room, you could be cut. Every day you walk in the locker room, you could be in front of millions of fans, and your life and your performance is being judged by the minute down to the inch. So I think that Paul George doing this is courageous. I think he's giving space to other professional athletes to stand up and talk about what they deal with, because it affects all of us. This is a global pandemic, and some of us are dealing with depression, anxiety for the very first time. So this is a serious topic, like I said. We have to push it to the forefront. And this is good news for Paul George. It's great news for the Clippers, and it's terrible news for LeBron James and those Lakers, Nick.
Well, Wilds, I'll let you go. We can get to the Lakers side of this in a second. I mean, whatever the reasoning was for Paul George, this version of Paul George, obviously, Wilds, is the one the Clippers, maybe not 35 points a game, 67%, but a top 12 player in the league level, Paul George, is the one they signed up for when they traded away all those assets to get him, Wilds.
Yeah, I want to build on what Brandon said. You know, like a few years ago, Kevin Love was praised for coming out and saying that he was battling some anxiety and some depression, but it wasn't right after a playoff game. Brandon, this is unprecedented, the amount of honesty and transparency that Paul George showed. Really needs to be applauded. You also saw Giannis talk a little bit about it. I don't know if it was necessarily mental health, but he did mention, it's like, the bubble's tough. It's tough I can't really get away. And talking to you about building that it's a problem for the Lakers. Do you think that Paul George's transparency and Paul shouting out the support system around the Clippers will be directly transferable onto the court?
100%. You have to think about this. This may be not only a breakthrough for this series and this run to the championship, but for his entire career, for the rest of his life possibly. Because we call this guy, playoff P, you know, and Nick, you've been on him. A lot of us been crushing him this entire series. But this guy seems to be free. So, of course, it translates, because 80% of what we do is mental. That's the beauty of sports. That's the beauty of life. But all of us, well, almost all of us, focus so much on the physical. So I think this could be a huge win for Paul George and this Clippers team.
Well, so the only pushback I would have is this. I agree with everything you guys are saying about the courage and the bravery it takes to be that naked, for lack of a better term, to the entire general public about what you're dealing with inside your own head. We all have, Brandon, you're someone that's been at the forefront of athletes talking about these types of things, so you know better than anybody how much courage it takes, but you also know better than anybody, this isn't, if you are really dealing with some anxiety, some depression, you don't snap out of it because of a bad game. Or because of a good game, pardon me. Like, this is something that you are going to have to deal with, not only the rest of this series, the rest of these playoffs, but it's a multi-month, year, sometimes lifelong battle that you have to wage. And so I want to take Paul George's words at face value, but if I am taking them at face value, Brandon, I think it is doing a disservice to the real issues he's talking about. To be like, the perfect medicine is 35 points. Like, that's not it. Like, that's a Band-Aid for maybe... go ahead.
It can be, Nick. It can be, because anxiety, depression can present itself in almost over 250 different ways. For some people, you're right, it could last a lifetime. For some people, like the majority in the world right now, could be dealing with it for the very first time. This is a global pandemic. We are isolated. We are in quarantine. And now you take this group of men and you throw them in a bubble. Of course, they're going to be mentally challenged. Now, when you look at Paul George, I don't know his history. I don't know what he's dealt with in the past. We should be curious, because every time there's a big moment in the playoffs, this whole playoff P thing comes up. But it can easily be a moment for him where this 35 points, the high five in his teammates, the smiles on his faces throughout the game last night could be that moment to get him through this crisis.
It's also just another opportunity.